So we discussed how there are locks that are put on content, and there are locks that are put on devices. And it might be interesting, just as a little experiment here, to compare how the law and the conversations treat copyright holders versus technology owners, and the language that's used. So each of these owners can have their rights infringed. And I'm going to start by trying to lower the rhetoric a bit and say that infringement is not theft. It is not the same thing at all. The owner, in the case of an infringement, still owns, still possesses what they own. Whether we're talking about copyright infringement or technology copyright infringements, you still possess the thing that you own. It hasn't been taken away from you. It's not unavailable to you. Infringement does lower that property value. If you are the copyright holder and people are infringing your copyright all over the place, your ability to make a living from that copyrighted work is diminished. So the property value is reduced. And it's the same thing for the owners of technology, that the value of this property gets reduced when my rights are infringed. So it's the same type of thing. The better comparison than theft, and again, there's no connection to theft at all. So any of that's just abusive rhetoric. The closest analogy is to trespass. So yes, trespass doesn't take away the thing that you own. Trespass can be economically or morally harmful to you. There's more than just economic rights that we should be concerned with. It could be harmless. The trespass could be harmless to you. Trespass could actually benefit you. But the point is that infringement is much more analogous to trespass than it is to theft. So when you're comparing infringement of copyright with infringement of technology property rights, who is doing that is different. But we can still discuss direct infringement versus contributory infringement. And as you'll notice from the various discussions, there's a wide variety of respect for copyright, and respect and disrespect for copyright, and then a wide variety of respect and disrespect for technology property rights. So let's discuss copyright, direct infringement. Unauthorized peer-to-peer file sharing of music, movies, television by private citizens. There's a very often talked about direct infringement of copyright. You can talk about the commercial creation of copies that are then sold. There is a commercial infringement example, again, quite often discussed. These are going to sound very familiar. Then you have the concept of secondary and contributory infringement, where you have entities that are not themselves doing the infringement, but are somehow considered to be contributing to the infringement, and so therefore are liable as a secondary liability regime. And so internet service providers are often discussed, and there's various different things saying, well, as long as the service providers, for instance, in Bill C-11, do notice and notice, and they follow that regime, then they're not going to be considered liable. Otherwise, they are going to be considered liable for the infringement. So if they don't pass on those messages, in the United States, they have a notice and takedown, where if an internet service provider receives a notice and they don't take the material down, then they are considered liable for that infringement. In the United States, under a case called Grokster, they talked about this concept of inducement, where it says one who distributes a device with the object of promoting its use to infringe copyright, as shown by clear expression or other affirmative steps taken to foster the infringement, is liable for the resulting acts of infringement by third parties. That's inducement. And you'll hear discussion about ISO Hunt and Pirate Bay, which, in theory, enable infringement. And Bill C-11 contains an enabler provision that specifically says that if you provide a service primarily for the purpose of enabling acts of copyright infringement, then you yourself are liable as a secondary infringer. So that's the copyright part of the conversation, and it's the part of the conversation people hear most often. So here's the equivalent discussion discussing information technology property rights. So examples of direct infringement. Well, installing malware is an example of a direct infringement. Applying locks to the devices without the owner managing the keys, and the previous owners retaining the keys, that's an example of a direct infringement. And denying and disabling the rights of the owners to remove foreign keys to apply their own locks, again, hiring the digital equivalent of a locksmith to change the locks, just like you would hire a locksmith to change the locks in your car, your home, or other property. Disabling that in some way would be an example of a direct infringement. So what are examples of secondary or contributory infringement? So if you're encoding your content in such a way that it's only accessible or interoperable with devices where the property rights have been infringed. So if the only way that you can access this is with some hardware where the owner's rights have been infringed, you are essentially enabling, inducing whatever language you want to use, which you're essentially creating the conditions by which people's rights will be infringed. And so I would consider that to be, again, you're not the infringer yourself, but you're the moral equivalent of the ISO hunts and the Pirate Bays of the world if you're doing that type of thing. So yes, I would consider those copyright holders putting technological measures on their content that forces people to use non-owner locked devices to be about the moral equivalent of ISO hunt and Pirate Bay. But really the worst enablers are legislators that are passing laws which legalize and legally protect these infringements in the first place. Copyright holders would not be doing this if it were not legal. They're essentially being given the right by the government to infringe other people's rights. Sounds like an insane idea, but that's essentially what we're talking about in these bills.